Okay, so here we are. I am about to get started on this training, and there's a lot to go through. I'm going to share a playblast, not playblast, a brand play of the plate. Okay, so the plate being the footage that we're looking at. Now, the whole idea of this was I wanted this to be more kind of shaky cam. It wasn't like an intentional whip pan with like a rack focus or anything that's very specific. I wanted something where we could all kind of come up with our own concept of what could be going on, rather than like, well, obviously that building gets hit and blah blah blah, just because that's where the way we shot it kind of leads up to. So the idea of this is that we're going to be doing a reverse gravity effect. So very similar to Man of Steel, Independence Day 2, and a lot of other films. And I like the idea of this because, and bear with me, I've actually sprained my wrist today of all days just a couple of hours ago, and so I'm not going to be too coordinated in the beginning of this, but just kind of going through here for a second. Having areas of this building kind of ripping up and going up in the air, I think it's going to be a really cool idea, but I also think that it's a little bit vanilla. It's a little bit just kind of like, it isn't that interesting, and I want to make this shot really interesting. So what I think would be really cool, okay, is to actually have like beams, blue beams kind of shooting down, and wherever they come down, that area begins to spread and rip up that part of the building or whatever's in that area. So maybe there's cars on the ground. Who knows what we're going to be doing. So I like the concept of that. I think that could be really cool to do. Just to kind of make it a bit more interesting, and we can do a lot more with this. Usually what we do is, it's called a handover. Now, like in the live action series, the like 1 year course where we go through, I don't know how many shots it is. It's like 15 or 20 visual effects shots. It's huge. What we do is we mimic what you do in real production. So in other words, you'll do like a shot handover. And what happens is the visual effects supervisor will assign the shots to specific artists. Then I'll walk them through what the plan is and ideally what we want to accomplish. And that's exactly what I want to do here. So usually what I would do is I would have a meeting where the artist would come in. I would discuss the shot with them. They would go off and start working on it. Then I would go and review their work. Now, what I think is cool here is, occasionally I'll do like paint overs. So in other words, I might find like a keyframe and I might just kind of scribble out what we want to accomplish. Because my wrist is completely screwed today, I think it'll be fine. I just need to take it easy and not use it too much. But I'm just going to more do like very quick paint overs of like what I want, rather than doing more of a paint, like a concept painting. So I'm going to make this green. I'm just going to simply go through this and kind of sketch up what I have in mind. So the idea, and I know I'm not going to be able to do a straight line right now, so I'm just going to have to do it this way. There's like a line coming down. I might make this red just so it's a bit more contrasty. But I just want to quickly go over what we intend to do in this shot. So imagine this being a blue beam will shoot down, and that area, okay, will begin to, all the rubble, all the stuff will begin to like get attracted upward where that beam is. So areas of this will begin to kind of break off, and those chunks will kind of float up in the air. So imagine that being an arrow. All these pieces will begin to raise up. Now, I don't want just like a blue beam kind of shooting down. I wouldn't mind this to kind of have some kind of particle matter kind of swirling around as well, just to kind of make it a bit more interesting. So that's the other thing, is that not only will we have geometry shooting, like raising up in the air, but I'm also going to have like a pretty interesting kind of particle beam going on. Now, the other thing about this is that I'd like there to be multiple beams. Okay, so initially you might have like one beam come down, and then like another, I knew that was going to happen, another beam comes down, and that one, that whole area begins to get ripped up, and we'll see like bits of debris, ripping up in the air. We'll see a lot of dirt, either trailing off of it, or maybe it's all raising up ahead of it because it's lighter density. Okay, so that's something we could take into consideration, is nothing really trails behind. Instead, a lot of that stuff kind of raises up ahead of it. And we can have like obviously little bits of debris matter all around. I don't think this would really happen, but we could go and add some explosive elements and fire, just as, more to make it look cool. And that's one thing that always happens on a lot of Hollywood films, is they're not reality, they're hyper reality. So in other words, typically in a Hollywood movie, you might start with what's real, and then you start to go into what's interesting. And so you watch like a lot of Michael Bay films. Like I remember on Transformers, there's shots that, it might do something in reality one way, but we're going to go and add in explosions and things like that just to kind of make it look cooler, even though it wouldn't happen in reality. So that's exactly what we consider here, is like, well, what's going to visually make things a bit more interesting. So again, adding like those swirly things, kind of happening here, having all that debris shooting up. Maybe even just before it even happens, like before the beam even comes down, we could even have like stuff kind of being attracted off of it. So it starts generating kind of like a light dust, as if all the smaller matter is starting to peel away. And then out of nowhere, like a beam shoots down, okay? And, kind of connects it. And there's like the swirliness. And then from there, all of it begins to rip apart. We could build, sorry, getting tongue tied. We could build a really kind of big sequence out of this, where we initially start out with one hero element, we work on that, we nail the effect, and then we're able to kind of replicate that by using more of a procedural workflow. Okay, so I kind of like the idea of initially we could have like a more of an attraction happening around it, so something kind of interesting, and then like I said, that beam kind of shoots down in the center, and all the swirlies and bits of it begin to rip apart, so you could have cracks. We do a lot with it. So that's the general idea. For us, like as we're discussing this, personally as an artist, not as a supervisor, I would start to kind of break down what elements I would need to actually create, and that way, more on the technical level, I'd be able to get a better idea of what I want to accomplish. So this is a wider shot. I basically got a few random frames. I want to kind of look at these and just kind of get an idea, because there's building, we can label these now, building 1, building 2, building 3, building 4, and I think that's it. There's another frame here. So there's building 4. So there's 4 buildings technically that we'd be looking at. So I'm going to label them 1, 2, 3, 4, just so that way you're aware of this, because I might refer to them as we're doing building 1 now, building 2, whatever. So the idea is that, again, we don't want to destroy the entire building, because if we had like the entire building being ripped up, it's just not going to look that interesting. You'd rather have areas breaking apart and kind of hint towards the entire building eventually being ripped up. Plus also then we need to paint in a background, like what's behind it, that sort of thing, which is fine. We can do all of that stuff. Now, here's a few tricky things to keep in mind. We have this, whatever it is, like big tower pole thingamajig here. Basically, this structure, I guess like an electrical line, this is in the foreground, and we don't actually have this modeled. It's pretty intricate. We could go and model it all and match it all. I don't really want to do that. What I would typically do is either paint it out. So in other words, in comp, we would paint out this here, and then just do a CG one. Or in this case, I'm going to look at trying to roto this out, so rotoscope it out. So in other words, we kind of create like an alpha for it, so that way that area of the footage is protected, and we kind of mat it out into the foreground. And that's going to go for a lot of this. So there's a couple elements we need. We initially have our plate, which is the original footage, okay? And we also have the roto, which I'll be supplying. I don't actually have it yet. I'm going to get onto this soon, but I'll be supplying like a black and white image, essentially protecting the layers of footage that we want to keep, okay? So if I were to look at the original footage, we can see here, this is all footage. We don't need this to be CG. We don't need it to be, 3D or anything, because none of this right now is going to get affected. It would be cool to kind of have all this being ripped up, but one big thing about this is obviously we're trying to do a lot in a short amount of time. So I'm going to make the calls about getting the biggest bang for our buck. In other words, all the way through this training, I'm going to try and build make the best decisions as to what to do and how to do it, so that way we can get the most from it without needing to go and do something really intricate that might we might spend a lot more time doing something that really isn't going to have that much effect on the final output. So all of this is live action, and then when we get to this building 1, that's when it becomes CG. Okay, so all of this is fine. It's pretty much at this point that we got to look in, what we're doing. All of this is going to be modeled in CG, so we're cool there. Now, if we look at the footage, there's a fence going along here. All of this is cool. There's, we need to kind of protect all of these layers. So we'll need to roto all of this, which I'll take care of. Rotoscope is not fun, at least not for me. This tower here is something that we also need to roto. These lines, we also need to roto. They're just things that, like, if we have CG, we want to make sure they fit behind it all without needing 3D geometry to mat it out. So, that for the most part is what we need to do. Is just we'll have roto for all of this stuff here. This so we can focus on the buildings, and and that will be it. Now, one thing is that at the very end of this, a lot of people were submitting ideas. It was really cool just to kind of see what ideas came up. But a lot of people wanted to do something with this water. Again, biggest bang for our buck. I want to really focus our energy on what we can get done in the shortest amount of time. And I will just kind of go on a bit of a rant here for a second and say that a lot of times I talk to people and, they want to work on a show reel, and they might say something like, hey, what kind of reel should I make? And I'll go back to them and say, well, how about you keep it simple? Why don't you just do like a bridge collapsing, and just something where you can focus your energy on one thing and make it really good, rather than making it too complex and having too many things going on, and the shot becomes average just because you're overextending yourself a little bit. So the problem is I've had so many people then come back like, Alan, okay, that sounds great. I'll make a bridge collapse, and I'll have like missiles flying overhead, hitting it, and they'll have like laser beam shoot out, and then the bridge collapses in the water, and the water splashes up, and blah blah blah. And suddenly it's like this really hideously long shot, which personally I wouldn't want to do. Just as like, in my spare time, it's a lot of work. So I'm not trying to simplify things, but I'm saying to look at where you're at, and if you want to get more ambitious and have like a beam hit the water and have that sucking up and like do some really awesome stuff with it, do it. But at the same time, you don't want to overcomplicate what you're doing by going too far and having like, just all these things like metal bending and warping and the paint flakes coming off and just all these things that might be too much work. Okay, so at least for now, focus on the big picture and getting those things done. And then from there, go for it. Go and create a more complicated shot. But when you're working on your reel, doing something like that, you want to keep it relatively straightforward, so that way you can make the things that you are working on the best they can be. All right. So with this, for now, we're going to do those 4 buildings being destroyed, as well as the laser effects, all the other things we're doing. I think it could be cool though to, in addition, have like some rocks kind of falling in the foreground and kind of rolling down this ramp here. I think just at the very end of the shot, it could be cool just to kind of see a lot of stuff kind of in the foreground. So that's one of those things that, again, we call it like a CBB or bonus round, depending on like where you work, what you're doing. I would say this is bonus round, meaning that, it's a wish list item. So we focus on the big picture. If we get ahead of schedule, we want to do rocks in the foreground falling and, coming down to the water, that sort of thing. We could do that as well, and that could be really awesome. But that's more bonus round. So I use that a lot if the client's like, hey, you know what? I want to have like all these ridiculous things, and these are the things that we budgeted for and we agreed on. But then they come back and say, oh yeah, and I want the foreground character's hair to like get wet and swirl around or do something ridiculous. Well, we could come back and say, okay, well, we'll see what we can do about that, but that's more bonus round. Let's get through this stuff. If we have time and it's in the budget, we'll do that as well. That way the client feels like they're getting heard. You're not saying, no, we can't do that. But at the same time, it's more if you have time to do it. And I'm surprised, but there's been plenty of times on productions where you actually do have a spare day or two, so that then you go and start doing all these additional things that would be, what would make the shot really polished, So the other term I mentioned was CBB, which means could be better. And that gets thrown around a lot. I usually say CBB, meaning that like we see a shot, it's looking good, but it's not amazing. So there's definitely improvements we could do as CBBs. In other words, if we have more time. But it's more, for me, I speak of that as being revisions. So, we have cracks going down here and, or a chunk of geo just isn't quite, looks a little bit too polygonal. I might make that a CBB that we could have a little bit of a breaking off as like a bonus round, basically. Things like that. So the main focus right now is these 4 buildings, having them rip up. I think the first things to do is to jump into 3D, and we'll work on the timing and try and get that all right. But, we're going to try and work on one building first, one beam first, get that all nailed. But we'll build it in a way that's quite procedural, so we can kind of then replicate it very easily. So this is the basic concept of what I'm working on here. So what I want to do is I want to just and again, usually I'd build a spreadsheet, and like again in LES, in the live action series, we do all this. We spend a lot of time in pre-production planning, building tools, doing a lot of cool stuff to kind of get ahead of the game with all this and treat it like a real production. But here I'm just going to scribble it all on one page. But the elements I would be thinking of would be, one would be, I'm going to go really small for this. One would be the I want to call it the initial dust. So this would be the kind of like dust beginning to swirl and come upward before anything actually happens, okay? That initially would happen. All right. And then from there, we would have like 2 would be a beam, okay? So we have this beam shoot down. And the beam itself is probably going to be the beam core. Hopefully you can understand my handwriting. Again, sprained wrist. Beam core, and then beam particulates or particles, we'll call it. But basically all the kind of swirly stuff here, okay? Those would be the 2 elements for the beam. All right. Then 3, we would also have when the beam comes down, I guess we would have the geo frag, so the bits of the building kind of breaking and raising up in the air. And then we would have all the, I'm going to call it secondaries, but this is going to be all the small debris, dust. And we could also do like a heat distortion effect. I don't know, like this is just, again, bonus round, but a distortion element. And that could just be something that kind of like, just more of a mirage, some kind of effect that makes it shimmer and just does something kind of like a bit more interesting with the whole effect. But I don't know, I think that could be a good starting point. We could also look into doing Explo or fire. So we could call this like pyro, basically. So that would be another element, and that would be something just to kind of help make it a bit more interesting, get more contrast, because I feel like we have the blue beam, but everything else is going to be very desaturated, very grays and browns. I don't think it's going to be visually that interesting. So pushing some reds and things in here could just make it look cool. So having bits of fire being sucked up or quick pops of explosions. Again, that's definitely a bonus round thing. All in all, I think that would be a good starting point. Having the beam come down, having all the atmospherics, having all the rocks ripping up, having some kind of fire explosions, bonus round stuff. But that could be really interesting as well. Now, there's definitely things in the foreground I would like to do just to kind of give this a bit more layering. More from a director's point of view, I guess. Having everything in the background here, it tends to make it less interesting. So we could upgrade this by making it more foreground by having lasers in the background here doing, stuff in the background. That's going to make this a more of a foreground element. You're going to get some kind of parallax. I still think it would be cool to have something in the foreground. I don't want to do anything with any of this, but it might mean that we have like, some kind of steam shooting up around the camera. And that just gives it that depth where we have some kind of element as if the water perhaps is being brought up, or something around the camera, just that traction coming up in the air. So again, I'm just throwing ideas out there, and like I said, this is a kind of crappy little concept, but it's more just to kind of convey the idea of what we're doing. I'm not trying to do like a proper concept image. It's more just a paint over. But this is the sort of idea that like we could do something really awesome with it. So I'm just going to say 6, and we'll just say FG steam or water spritz. All right, so just something in there to kind of give it that depth. We could also look at 7 BG elements. So I don't think we're going to do all of this, just because the time frame that we're in, we can only get so much done. But you definitely can, push it further if you want. But let's just see how we go. Maybe we can. This is something that I would do for myself. I would, if I was the artist or technical director working on the shot, I would typically just do a bit of a scribble up for myself, and this helps me kind of visually break down what I'm going to be doing, okay? Because again, I see so many artists that I supervise who just jump into 3D and start making stuff. They don't really plan the shots out. And then suddenly they're focusing so much on one element that you probably don't even see because you didn't think about the ordering of everything or the composition of the shot. So because of that, you end up focusing, you don't look at the big picture. For me, I'm always going to look at things as how they're coming out of comp. So how they're coming out of nuke. I don't care so much about the 3D part, because the 3D part is the hard part, but I got to look at the big picture. And I think the more that we kind of put ourselves in more of a supervisor or a producer's chair, the better we're going to work, because you start to look at things like with your time frame and more like, does this, like where I'm looking at bonus round elements, things like that. It's more like, can we get it done? Is it important? Is it really going to be critical to the shot? No, the fragmenting, the beam, those two things are the most important things, whereas all the other stuff is more icing on the cake. It's the things that are really going to help sell the shot, but they're not critical. Okay, so I prioritize from here. I build a schedule, and in the live action series, we do a lot of that. We schedule everything out. We do it as a bid. So this is something that, like at Blur Studio, we always did, which would be the artist are giving everything as a bid. So in other words, the supervisor would come in and say, all right, this is about 12 days to do the shot. And then they would break down all the elements, and it would be like, okay, 3 days for the nuke, 1 week for the water sim, blah, 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 blah. And then the artist gets given the bid, and they could come back and say, you know what, like, it's a nuclear bomb. I might need a week for that, but I think the water I've got a setup that I can already use, so there's probably 3 days. And you start to like figure out like whether the schedule fits or it doesn't, and then you start working on it. And it's a little bit different than some other studios where, like ILM, Industrial Light Magic, when we would get given shots, you're not really given a time frame. It's just like, here's your shot, go do it. And if it takes you a day, awesome. But if it takes you a week or a month, I don't know, your lead eventually is going to start saying, hey, where is stuff? We need it. And if they are like fast turnaround things where you need it right away, there is going to be pressure and there's going to be a deadline communicated. But a lot of the time, it's just like, go do it, make it rock, and you'll probably be juggling multiple shots. And that way, the pressure's off. You're just going to go at your pace, and you're going to keep making it better. But that's more of a bigger studio mentality. It's where you got artists 2,000 artists in a couple of buildings working on a bunch of different projects at a time. Whereas like Blur somewhere, it might be 50 to 150 people, depending on how busy they are. It's a little bit more hands-on, and you're more able to communicate easily with the team, and everyone's a bit more standalone in how they work. Whereas different studios have different processes. For me, I'll bid everything out. I'll try and figure out how long something's going to take. I'll communicate with the artist, like make sure they feel good about it all. I'll usually, whether I'm an artist or whether I'm a supervisor, I usually will do something similar to this. I'll do it a lot better than this. I'll do like a proper painting, a concept painting of what I intend to do. But if I'm the artist, I'm able to then show that to my supervisor, because the supervisor might come back and be like, oh, that explosion, like, let's just pull one of these up. I might come back and say, here's my explosion. And they're like, no, like it should be like this big. And everything in 3D takes way longer to do. So for me to like spend 30 minutes building something up and then communicate that to my supervisor. They come back like, no, make it this big. That saves me probably a day or 2 days of like messing around. And it's also harder once you kind of create something to then modify it drastically to a different setup. So having that kind of like back and forth quickly, as long as they have that foresight, can be really cool just to quickly, get the explosion to where it should be. And from there, you're able to kind of hit the ground running and go in the right direction the first time around. So I'll usually communicate what I intend to do. And like, again, like I'll bring up Blur again as a good example, but like Tim Miller, like 10 years ago or, more than that, I'd worked on projects where I'd show him concepts and he could quickly be like, all right, like do this, like line here. And we could easily visually communicate a shot, and then I could just go in and do it. And rather than second guessing myself, I knew exactly what I needed to do the first time around. Now, as a supervisor, same deal. I'm able to come in and say, look, this is what I got in mind. Big explosion here, stuff falling out here, blah, blah, blah. And then the artist knows like what they need to do, at least in terms of composition, size, timing, all that kind of stuff. So usually I would get a play blast and I would, take a few screen captures of that play blast and I would just paint over those, and then I would send those stills. So that way they could see at that exact frame what's going on in the shot. And the cool thing is as well, and I know I'm rambling about this, but this is really important. The cool thing about this is also you might realize as you're doing it, because then you're in the trenches doing it, I might come back and realize, you know what, like most of this beam that I had coming down here, you're not even going to see it. So maybe we should just not worry about that. I'll make it a bonus round one, and we'll just focus on these 3 beams here, and we'll disregard this one. Or I can communicate to the client, hey, you know what? We looked at that beam that you sent over the previs for or something, and like with the footage, the final footage you gave us, it isn't really in the right place. So we're going to move it over here. Do you have any problem with that? So again, having that foresight before you get into something is just so critical. Okay, so you can kind of, or you can look at something, and the more you have an image, the more you can discuss it. So, let's say there was a beam here and it's being occluded. We could communicate that like, oh, that'd be really cool if you actually have like light rays peeking behind this, this beam here, or pillar or whatever, struct, just because it's being occluded. So everything's kind of dark and it's kind of like blasting out volumetric rays, something like that. Just the more you can kind of discuss the shot, the more you can kind of get ideas for it that are more accurate in terms of 3D and everything else. Like I could say, oh, you know what? Like we have this thing here. Wouldn't it be cool if we actually simulate like a rigid, not a rigid body, like a soft body of like this metal pipe, like being ripped up separately than all this, which is concrete. And these metal sheets, it'd be cool if they kind of break apart differently, and you can get really into the shot a lot more than you could just by looking at the shot, right away. The more you can kind of paint and talk about it. Once it gets into 3D, to turn anything around is so much more work. It's so much more clunky and so much more expensive. So I'm always looking at 2D whenever I can to try and get the best solutions ahead of time, and then you go into 3D. Okay, so the more you kind of think about the end shot rather than thinking about, okay, like I've got my 3D building, I'm gonna make this really complex, cool thing that I can brag about, like how I have a billion nodes, and it's all automated and you have no control. I really try and push that with all my students in in live action series, like not to overcomplicate shit just for the sake of overcomplicating it. I want you to really think of the big picture, and that's the kind of artists that I get promoted, that get paid more money, because you're not getting bogged down, wasting time. You're able to communicate with the producers, the directors, the supervisors, the compositors, all the other people around you a lot better because you're thinking big picture. You're not thinking about your stuff. Like again, I hate when I'm in meetings and someone starts talking about, oh yeah, I could totally do that, and they start nerding out about the new 3D approach that they can go and overcomplicate shit. I'm always going to think, okay, you know what, like the stuff in the background, we could just do a separate element for all of that and just distribute cards, in Nuke in 3D in the background for all these different beams, and that way we can turn them on and off very quickly. There's no simulations required. We just have like one element that we could just distribute everywhere, and That way the compositor can sit with the director and they can nail that. You know, I'm always thinking about what's the best way to go about doing something rather than what's the technical way. You do the technical once you figure out all the timing and all the more key beats that you need to figure out. So this is a bit of a long handover, but I think it's really critical to kind of hit the ground running with what we're doing. So in the next video, we're actually going to dive into 3D now, knowing all of this, and we're going to start to look at creating all of the effects. You know, start working on the timing, start doing all this stuff, and looking at these elements being a lot of the key ones that we're going to do. Okay, so let's move on.